we ready? Good morning. Thank you for braving the rain and coming out. You are in for a enlightening treat this morning. The speaker here this morning is Michael Mendizza. Michael has many credits, actually too many to even enumerate, but mainly Michael has been a great friend of Krishnamurti personally, and a friend of the foundation. And in his 30-plus year career with us, Michael has produced some amazing products. I can give you a shameless infomercial and describe the multitude of products, films, tapes, books, video series that he has done. Probably the most outstanding was the documentary film, The Challenge of Change, which stands today as the definitive film documentary of Krishnamurti and his life. Then he did another one called With a Silent Mind, which is a film of interviews with various people who talk about Krishnamurti. Parallel with that, Michael has done over a 25-year period interviews with the people who were around Krishnamurti, who were close to him, his friends, trustees, staff, people who worked with Krishnamurti, and that remains an extraordinary treasure in the archives, which hopefully someday soon will be released on television. Additionally, he did a series called Beyond Myth and Tradition, 12 half-hour, very, very helpful and informative videos on subjects: the sacred, choiceless awareness, meditation, conflict, what is the religious mind. His most beautiful book is probably the book called Flowering, which is a series of photographs that he took. Some are in this room, which have been coupled with quotes from Krishnamurti. It is a remarkably beautiful book, evocative, sensitive, and powerful pictorial description of what Krishnamurti is talking about. Now, coming to today, Michael has spent the last 5 years with Professor Samdang Rinpoche, who was the first Prime Minister of the Tibetan people in exile, the spiritual advisor to the Dalai Lama, and a remarkable scholar. Michael interviewed Samdang Rinpoche over a period of time and has produced an incredible book, which is a selection of those interviews. The book is titled Always Awakening. And today Michael is going to explore this book with us and go into the multitude of dimensions of Buddhism and Krishnamurti that are revealed in this exchange between two men who are extraordinary students of the teachings and were both great friends of Krishnamurti. Michael Mendizza.
Good morning. Gosh. So, Always Awakening, the title. Let's just begin with that. I look at the title, Always Awakening, Buddha's Realization, Krishnamurti's Insight, as almost an organizational chart, with Always Awakening being the mission vision, if you want to call it that, and then the two teachers, what we refer to as the Buddha, and then Krishnaji, equal, parallel. And there was some discussion, should there be a hyphen? Should there be a this and should there be a that? And I said, no, they should not be separated with a hyphen. They should be one, actually. And this is a rather audacious, claim to make graphically, to say Krishnamurti and the Buddha were basically the same. Now, I didn't make that up. This was one of the core insights or core themes that Rinpoche shared in our conversations together. He said there's only one realization, there's only one enlightenment. Anybody who becomes realized or awakens sees the same thing. How they express it is unique, but the vision is common. And I love that. That was just such a wonderful context, such a wonderful way to frame not only the book and not only Krishnamurti, but it gives us a historical framework to look at what Krishnamurti was saying. This whole body of work, thousands of pages, over 60 or 70 years of him speaking, this gives a framework or a context to understand what this represents. So, Always Awakening, Buddha's Realization, Krishnamurti's Insight is this basically says what the whole book is about. I have to go in a little bit about who Samdam Rinpoche is, because I say, and again rather dogmatically or outrageously, that there's no one else on the planet, in the world, who has his tradition, his training, his culture, his way of looking, that spent quality time over many years in dialogue with Krishnamurti. There's nobody else like him that could share the particular frame that we explored. And I considered that enormously important historically, that he be engaged with that, because he's quite shy and he wouldn't do it on his own. He wouldn't come out and make all these kinds of things. He was very courteous. He was, I said, could we meet? I actually sent him a book many years ago, in the early 70s. I came across a book called The Secret Oral Teachings in Tibetan Buddhist Sects by Alexander David Neal. And it was a small little volume, and I read it and kept returning to it many years. I would read it and see something new and come back a couple of years later and read it again and discover something new, as you've all experienced. The essence of this was that we're not who we think we are. The essence of that secret teachings in Tibetan Buddhism was that we're not who we think we are. And it, had a very traditional way of going about this, but it began by exploring how they would dissect, shall I say, who we think we are. The question or the observation that we're not who we think we are has two frames. One is, what is the false view that we're not? and then revealing what and who we really are. So those two sides are implicit in the one question or the one observation, that we're not who we think we are. So not being a Buddhist and not being a scholar in this at all, I sent Rinpoche this little book and asked him to tell me whether it was correct or accurate, or did it really represent Tibetan Buddhism. And based on that, he came to California in 2008 at the invitation of the Santa Barbara University, and we had our first meeting at that point, and I videotaped an interview with him, which was about an hour and a half. A few years later, we were together at Brockwood Park for a week, and I asked him if we could continue, and he agreed. So we snuck away during that week for 2 or 3 sessions actually, and continued our conversation. And then someone had actually listened to these conversations, and they said, "Oh my gosh, this is so great. What you have here is so wonderful. You must do a book." And it wasn't my intention to do a book, and it certainly wasn't his intention to do a book. But it became apparent after looking back and listening to what we had actually covered that this really was rare and distilled material. So I asked him if I could come to India, and I did in 2014 and spent a week, and we met 5 more times. Now that's a lot of time. The Tibetan hierarchy is very hierarchical, and he sits right beneath the Dalai Lama in terms of his position in this tradition. So to be able to have such a familial, and again, I'm from Los Angeles, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not part of the structure, so for me to be able to come and ask the kinds of questions in a very informal way, in a very familiar way, was a unique quality of the dialogues that we shared. So the book was basically 16 hours of conversations about all kinds of themes with this rare one person in the world that shares this perspective. And I began my tenure with the Krishnamurti world mid-70s, so 40 plus years ago. So there was a rich foundation for the conversation. This idea that we are not who we think we are was common, because if you really take a look through that lens at what we call the teachings of Krishnamurti, you'll find that this is the central theme. And I'll just go on a little bit. One of the insights, or one of the things that Rinpoche shared with me, was what he called 3 different qualities of meditation. And this was also in the book, The Secret Oral Teachings, but it's expressed a little differently. The first level of meditation that he called it, you could call it a practice, was being able to pay attention. Now, if you look at Krishnamurti's work, you'll see this is right at the base. You can't do anything if you can't pay any attention. You know, if you're scattered, it's scattered and so on. So being able to be attentive, be present and attentive, was the foundation. I call it kindergarten. I said it, spiritual kindergarten was gathering attention. You look at the meditation practices, such as being able to stare at the wall in Zen meditation, or whatever those things are, doing a mantra over and over again. All of these things are to cultivate being able to be fully present. In their tradition, if they would go off to the caves with the student and the master and that sort of thing, and if one could hold your attention present for 4 hours without distraction, then you were on your way. So that was a pretty high standard. The second level of meditation, which was fascinating to me, was using the cause of our disease as the cure or the medicine for our disease. So if we look at thought as being the cause of our disease, our misuse of thought, etc. Not well. Anyway, if we look at it kind of an unbridled thought as the cause of much of our suffering, many of our problems, then in the Tibetan practice they use a very specific form of logic to negate all the false images that we have about ourselves and others. That's a great thing, right? Now, if you flip the coin and look at Krishnamurti's teachings, I would say that 90% of what Krishnamurti talked about was this second level. Love is not jealousy, etc., etc. So Krishnamurti was basically in this, what I would call this second level most of the time, where he was challenging the false assumptions that we have and the false images that we have, the false beliefs that we have about self and others, saying that there's something else besides that. So there's a parallel there. I mean, I think it's a wonderful parallel. The third level of meditation in the Rinpoche was sharing had to do with, now assume that you had gathered all of your energy and attention. You have this now capacity to be fully present and attentive, and you're not wasting all of that energy chasing after false images that you have about yourselves. False images, and that implies feelings. Every image, mental image, has a corresponding emotion. So false images and all of that that's going on. What if you didn't do that? What if you had all this energy and it wasn't being wasted chasing all of these false images that we have about ourselves and others? You would have tremendous energy, you would have tremendous vitality, and it would be clear. And I would say creative and even causal. I would use the word causal in terms of creation. Now you're being able to channel or express creation in a very intense way. And this is basically what is called Tantra in their practice, is moving into this rather creative causal use of energy and attention in a way that serves the well-being of everybody. And if you look at those little frameworks, those little meditation things, you're going to find that in Kay's teachings, all of those things are quite present. The Rinpoche was really deeply concerned about comparison. And I think it's really important to, let me find this page. This is at the very beginning of the book. He says, agreement and disagreement are complicated words as we try to compare the similarities and differences between Krishnamurti and Buddhist teachings. Agreement and disagreement. Comparative study is valid only in the fields like physics and history. There is no comparative study in the spiritual field. There's no comparative study in the spiritual field. Therefore, we cannot compare Buddha's teachings and Krishnamurti's teachings. We have to be very clear about this. Having said that, we're conditioned or trained in the Buddhist, he's referring to himself here, we are conditioned or trained in the Buddhist philosophy, logic, metaphysics, and so forth. When we come to Krishnamurti, his message resonates with a person who has a Buddhist background. In a similar way, a person familiar with Krishnamurti's insights will find that his message complements Buddhist philosophy. Our effort must be in that direction, not finding similarities and dissimilarities, not comparing, not finding agreements and disagreements. Using Buddhist language, agreements and disagreements are all in the realm of relative truth. And there is no end. But the modern Westerner has been trained in comparative study. That is a good academic exercise, but it does not help in understanding Krishnamurti or the Buddha. So we need to emphasize that as we kind of explore and talk about some of the things that are going on in the book, we have to be mindful that we have this tendency to compare this and that, and he cautioned us against that. So what we want to do is basically appreciate that these two teachers had a similar or the same realization or the same core perception, and then they expressed what they saw in completely different ways. And that helps give a framework for this. And that has to do with time, with culture, with language, who the audience was, etc., etc. So that's really quite helpful in appreciating what we're trying to do in this work here, or in the book. I'd like to cover a couple of things. I thought about, if I were going to interview me, what questions would I ask about this work? And the first one is, why did I spend 5 years on the project? And I hinted at that at the very beginning, saying that you have a person here who's rare in the world, and there is this corresponding resonance between his tradition and the Buddhist philosophy and what Krishnamurti was saying. And I felt it was really quite important that this context or framework be brought out and shared. And I was personally quite curious. So again, I didn't do this to write a book. I did this because I saw this resonance and wanted to explore it more deeply myself. So that's why I did it. And again, we've talked about who Rinpoche is. In 1987 is when I first met him. I traveled to India. This was the year after Kay died, and we were doing these interviews with people who were close to him and influenced by him. And I met him first in Sarnath, which was where Buddha gave his first talk. He was at that time the head of a rather prestigious Tibetan educational institution there, and he was gracious enough to give us, do an interview. And I'd like to read for you, and again, I'll have to find it, what he shared during that first interview.
What page?
I'm sorry?
Page.
What page is it on here? I would say it's on page 16 in my little book. And I'm going to read it to you because I think that his observations here are so distilled and so accurate and give a wonderful framework for everything else that we're doing. The Buddha and Krishnaji both tried to communicate the reality they perceived. But it is very difficult to describe the similarities and dissimilarities between these two personalities. They lived in different times, in different environments, they had different listeners. One thing we can say in definite terms, is that Buddha and Krishnamurti approached this challenge very differently. Now again, the challenge is, how do they describe the perception and this insight that they had? Rinpoche goes on, when Buddha teaches the people, he comes down to the level of the listener, whereas Krishnaji does not come down to the level of the listener. He always speaks from his level. The Buddha deals with two levels, namely the relative and the absolute. When Buddha speaks of the absolute, personally, I do not find any difference with Krishnaji's teachings or Buddha's teachings as they pertain to the absolute truth. So this is a core statement for me. When I am looking, and this is one of the most respected Buddhist scholars in the world, when I'm looking at Buddha's teachings regarding the absolute, and when I listen to Krishnaji, I see no difference. So here's this back to the title, these two had the same realization. They are both Buddhas in that way. As I was doing some research for this, the term Buddha doesn't really refer to Peter or Paul or Sam or the person. Buddha is the state of realization. Buddha consciousness, they say. Buddha consciousness. It's not the person, the personality, Fred. So anyone who has this realization is a Buddha. And Rinpoche is basically saying it right here, way back in 87, that was what he, as a scholar, experienced. When Buddha speaks of relative truth, he always compromises with the acceptance and notions and thoughts of the people with whom he is speaking. But Krishnaji never compromises or accepts the conditions or the levels of the listener. The other difference between them has to do with preparation of the listener. Krishnaji is silent or does not speak about preparation, whereas the Buddha dealt a great deal with preparation of the person to reach the level of transformation. Both share a similar position that the moment of transformation or transmutation does not involve time, no graduation, it must be spontaneous and immediate. The perception is the perception. There is no growing slowly, there's no graduation or becoming, anything like that. But the Buddha dealt with preparation of the person to reach that level, whereas reach that certain graduations, whereas Krishnamurti never accepted these things. From my perspective, woven into these things, this idea that the moment of perception is the moment of perception, and that you can't get there, all the preparation that you're going to do isn't going to be the bridge, it's an unbridgeable gap, is all woven into everything Krishnamurti talks about. You see it when you start looking at it in that way. You see that this is absolutely implicit in everything Kay says. I would like to say, for me personally, I was around this time. It was a little earlier. This was when we were filming the first documentary, The Challenge of Change. I was in Brockwood Park and sitting across the table with Krishnamurti at lunch, and we were talking. He asked me, sir, do I really think that making this documentary is going to make any difference? And I said, well, I don't know, but I think we should try. And he just smiled and said, let's go on with it then. But then he leaned over and he said, sir, this is so damn simple. He said, it's as simple as this table or that chair. He said, I've only said one thing my whole life, but I've said it 1,000 ways. That, to me, is also a critical framework or perception, way of looking at the teachings. Because with thousands, I don't know how many pages are in the collected works. I mean, thousands of pages. Krishnamurti is the most well-documented teacher ever. And you can spend a long time reading 10,000 pages or 5,000 pages of material. But there's something important about it, which is in this statement that I've only said one thing my whole life, but I've said it 1,000 ways. So I went through some of the quotes. When I say some of the quotes, let me see if I can give a context to this. When I prepared to go to India, and also when I prepared to go to the UK to meet with Rinpoche, I felt like I really had to do my homework. Now, I had had 30 years with Kay, so I understood Krishnamurti pretty well. But I didn't know much about Buddhism, and certainly not Tibetan Buddhism, enough to engage with a scholar of his caliber. So I ended up reading 7 or 8 books by the Dalai Lama and several academic texts, and tried to really understand what the basics were. And also there were favorite quotes of mine that distilled Kay's teachings. And then I found that there were parallel quotes as I went through. Dalai Lama was saying this and he was saying that. And as a filmmaker, part of your craft is to create relationships, because it's when you take this and then you put this next to it, you've now created a relationship, and the relationship between those two scenes or those two cuts or whatever it is change what you experience. So creating relationships and creating juxtapositions is part of the art of filmmaking. And as a filmmaker, that's how I approached the book. So I began to, as we began constructing the book, I would take the narrative and I would take all the notes that I had prepared. When I arrived in India, I had 3 notebooks. They were each an inch thick, printed double-sided, with quotes and references from Kay and Bohm and everything I could find, so that I would have a good resource to engage this professor with. So I was constantly going through my notes and saying, well, what about this, sir? And what do you think about that, sir? And so those quote references became part of the format of the book. So on the one side, you have our narrative, and on the other side, you actually have the quotes that were the sources that triggered the dialogue, if that makes sense. So you actually have the actual references that I was using as part of our conversation, parallel as you read. And it's really quite, I think, a very powerful attribute for the book, because you have this you read this and then you read this, but it changes. When you read the quote and then you reread the narrative that we had, you get a completely different impression, and it deepens. It's like a meditation itself. So back to this idea that I've only said one thing my whole life, but I've said it 1,000 ways. I would like to read you a couple of things. Now these are quotes by Kay that are in the book, and I want you to listen for these core qualities that we just talked about. Is there a way of living without conflict? I say there is, obviously, which is to understand the division, to understand the conflict, to see how fragmented we are. Seeing the fragmentation which brings about conflict, which brings about division, which brings about this constant battle, anxiety, strain, heart failure, you follow. So that's what's happening. To see it, to perceive it. And the very perception brings an action which is totally different from the action of conflict. Because the action of conflict has its own energy, brings its own energy, which is divisive, which is destructive, violent, but the energy of perception and acting is entirely different. That energy is the energy of creation. That quote, from my perspective, embodies the essence of what Krishnamurti was talking about. Implicit in this are those 3 divisions that we talked about, those 3 types of meditation that we talk about. If you recall, you have, can you pay attention? Second, dissolving, negating all the false images that you have about yourself and others, which he's just simply calling conflict. He would call it sorrow. The Tibetans, what do they call it? Suffering. Dukkha, I think is the word that they give to it. Our trouble and travail. So implicit in this one quote with Anderson are all 3 of those forms of meditation, paying attention and so on, and also creation, that causal creation thing which is woven back into Tantra. One quote. I use the word fractal. I think Krishnamurti's, the complete teachings, is fractal by nature, which is a pattern that repeats itself at all the different scales. So another quote. The negation of thought is attention, as the negation of thought is love. If you're seeking the highest, you'll not find it. It must come to you, if you're lucky. And luck is the open window of your heart, not thought. Again, to me, these could overlap. They're just different metaphors pointing to exactly the same thing, over and over and over again. He only said one thing, he said it 1,000 ways. And I love this overlay, this fractal way of looking at the teachings. So now, this one is from way back in '66. It's also, to me, one of the most direct and poignant and focused statements of embodying the totality of what K talked about his whole life. What we're trying in all of these discussions and talks here is to see if we cannot radically bring about a transformation of the mind. Rearranging the furniture, having another thought, is not a radical transformation of the mind. So when he says a radical transformation, he's talking about the state of the mind. And the state of the mind that is analyzing, thinking, talking, using cognitive processing is one state. Silence, when that stops, another state happens. That's the radical transformation. Not accepting things as they are, nor revolting against it. Revolt doesn't answer a thing, but to understand it, to go into it, to examine it, to give your heart and your mind and everything you've got to find out if there's a way of living differently. Again, here you've got attention. Can you give your attention to this challenge that we're talking about? But that depends on you and not somebody else, because there is no teacher, no pupil, no leader, no guru, no master, no savior. You yourself are the teacher, the pupil, the master, the guru. You are everything. When you put that question because you're serious, because you are intent, then you're aware of the whole process of the observer. You're not who you think you are. Which means that you're totally attentive. Completely attentive. And that attention, there is no border created by the center. And when there is complete attention, there is no observer. The observer comes into being only when, in that look, there is inattention, which is distraction. This is so distilled. We've put away the observer, and therefore there is attention, which may last a second. That's good enough. Don't be greedy to have more. In that greed to have more, you've already created the center. And then you're caught. This too, I mean, you could just, this is so central, right? And if you could take this lens and you can look at all of page after page of the teachings, and you can take these few frames and you'll see that they hold true throughout the whole thing, every time. When there's no observer with complete attention. So back to the Tibetan thing about attention. Can you give attention? Anyway, all of this is really quite woven. And then you have these two historical frameworks where these two teachers who had the same perception tried to express as best they could what can't be put into words. In talking with the Rinpoche, this idea that the word is not the thing. He said, well, there's a couple of things that we go into a lot in 16 hours. One of the impressions or one of the insights that he gave was, that it's impossible for the unrealized mind to fully grasp what the realized mind is pointing to. Does that make sense? Is that clear? So when the realized mind says, and all they can do, they can't give you the experience. All they can do is say, look over here. You know, all they can do is point. They can point out how you're hitting your thumb with the hammer. You know, they can point that out, but it's up to you to realize and to see what they're pointing to. So when we were talking about things like the masters and other realms and other states and all these other possibilities, he said there's something that the unrealized mind converts, he said. He used the words converts. There's a conversion. So we take a description of something that we don't understand, and our mind translates it into something that we think we understand. Does that make sense? Then we say, oh, I understand. But what we are understanding is not what they're talking about. What we're understanding is pedaling or treading water where we've always been. So we convert their insight into the known. We take the unknown and convert it into the known is one way of saying it. And then we go on and we talk about it and we create systems and all kinds of things. So this idea of this conversion from the unknown to the known, and if you go back historically into what Kay was talking about, he said this way back in the 20s and in the 30s, this conversion issue. Stepping it down, taking something magnificent and stepping it down and making it something else is how he dealt with that. So this conversion issue was a really important thing. Let's talk about some of the things that are actually, some of the themes that we actually covered in the book. And we can actually open this up a little bit and actually talk about some of them. One of the core themes that we began with, which is central to the whole Buddhist tradition, is what he called misperception. We build what we think of as reality, and I use that in a very broad, encompassing way, the word reality. What we call reality is a mental construct. And this is basically in this idea that we're not who we think we are, the self issue. We attribute all kinds of qualities to who we think we are that really aren't real, or you can't find them. They're not tangible. So there's a fundamental misperception of what reality is central to understanding the Buddhist position. And again, I would say if you go back historically with what Kay's descriptions are, you'll find the same ideas, the same concept. When he realized, and again going back to the pepper tree and some of the early 20s and so on and so forth, when he really came into his own, his reality changed. He was actually looking at the world through a completely different lens, and he was no longer misperceiving. So misperception was a core concept. We talked about emptiness. In the Tibetan tradition, emptiness or the void is a major theme. Kay would call it, he used the word silence. It's the absence of the false reality that our cognitive brain creates. So when that stops, another reality is evident, is apparent. You don't have to chase after it. You simply have to stop wearing the glasses that make you see what isn't real. Or relative would be a more accurate word. That little faux pas, that difference between relative and true and so on and so forth, let's go back to something that the Rinpoche was really quite insistent about. Part of this second level of meditation, which was negating all the false images and feelings that you have about self and others, required a very precise, logical, almost mathematic way of using thought to dissect all the false constructs that thought produces. Does that make sense? So he said you have to be very, very precise with talking about these things. You can't just use words randomly and assume that we're being clear about it. As I was reading through the biography of the Dalai Lama, there was at one point in his training, he had to go debate, the elder scholars. And this was an example of this rigor, this intellectual rigor of using thought in a very mathematical, orderly way so that you're not chasing after false assumptions. And he insisted on a very quality of precision. One of the benefits, or I think, one of the treasures that this volume offers is that you get to share in the distilled mind, heart and mind of this teacher, of Rinpoche. When you read it and you listen to his words and how he's describing what he's describing, this tradition of precision and clarity of thought, accuracy of thought, is there. It's on the page. Every time he speaks, you are being bathed in a certain quality of logic and clarity and thoughtfulness that is rare. I told him, I said, being with him was refreshing because it was a reminder, or it illustrated what this quality of thought and care, of attention brings. I said it was very similar to being with David Bohm. David brought a very precise, scientific, mathematical kind of logic to his conversations with Kay and everything he did. And so there was a resonance in this care and thoughtfulness that he did. We talked, what is it that reincarnates? He challenged the word reincarnation. He said that's a kind of a sloppy word. It's been accepted and, people use it, but it's not very good. If there is a continuation, it doesn't reincarnate. It's not that there's no reincarnation, there's a continuation. And those are fundamentally two different ways of doing it. So here you are in the presence of this guy who's using these terms very precisely, and it helps. It helps us be more careful and more precise. And that's one of the things that non-content benefits of sharing the journey that we had. I mentioned to him that I apologized because he was forced, dealing with me, who's not a student and not on his level at all academically. He had to use relatively simple metaphors and stories and explanations to bring down and share with me the concepts that he was doing. and I said, it's like spiritual kindergarten. But I was talking about us, all of us, not just me. What we're doing, where we're at with all of our care and quest, is really a spiritual kindergarten. The distilling of our mind, beginning to come to know ourselves, to have a deep perception about how imagination works, thought being an imaginative structure. So thought and imagination are paired, are twinned. So in order to understand thought, one needs to really understand how the brain creates images and which ones are real and which ones aren't, and is there a, anyway. So these 3 levels of meditations that we started with is part of this coming to know ourselves. First, being able to pay attention. Without attention, you can't do anything. Second, understanding the nature of the whole thought process, which again is where Kay spent most of his time pointing to. And then being able to use your creative potential, your causal energy, attention and energy, to act in ways that serve well-being for everybody. So that's the spiritual journey, I think. And we are mostly in kindergarten because we don't do our homework at the very beginning. Negating the self-image is a game changer. Because if you have your creative energy and it's being used in the service of what we call ourself or our ego, then obviously it's going to take us down this road. So in order to really use our energy correctly, we need to negate the ego, and then this causal form comes into being, and our actions are going to be completely different. And again, you can find that page after page in Krishnaji's teachings. We already mentioned this idea of distortion, converting the unknown into the known, and how we do that regularly when we read enlightened works. Meaning that we have to experience it ourselves. We have to experience what the teachers are pointing to, and then it's real to us. And again, this is so basic, but we forget. In the Secret Oral Teachings, there was a wonderful description of how teachings are transmitted. And it said, the highest level is telepathic. No words. Person doesn't even have to be in the same place. And this shared telepathic resonance or shared meaning, to use a Bohm term, takes place. And I asked the Rinpoche about this. I said, is this? He said, well, yes, of course. I said, are there teachers today that are teaching using telepathy? He said, yes. And we went into that in the book. He said the next step down from telepathic communion is presence, meaning being in the same room. He used the word gesture and almost tangible expression, being in the presence of. And again, as I was driving up the road, I don't know about you, but I feel a certain resonance here on these hallowed grounds. There is a presence when coming to the grove and being with Krishnaji. There certainly was a presence that made understanding what he was pointing to more real, more direct, rather than cognitive. And so this second level of teaching, which was presence and gesture, was something that we explored. And he said, the grossest form of teaching is through words. Most likely for distortion, misunderstanding, painfully slow in terms of trying to actually get across what you're trying to get across. And then we talked later about this in terms of Kay's living presence today, near the end of the book. In the Tibetan, shall we say, worldview, Kay's not gone. He lived for a certain period of time, and all that time he was radiating a certain presence in the field of humanity. And just because his physical body died doesn't mean that resonance that he shared, that he was, it's still here. And then we talked about attunement. That to really understand what Krishnamurti was talking about doesn't come through the words, because that is the grossest form. It comes through resonant attunement. You becoming attuned to the quality of perception that he lived in. So attunement became the way to really live the teachings, as Krishnaji often said, attunement. And it's not even attunement to what we think of as K. It's attunement to what K was experiencing himself, which really isn't him, and in this way that we think of K and the Buddha and so on. It's not, the Buddha isn't Frank, the Buddha is the state of realization. So these ideas about attunement, teaching, sensitivity, and so on, we talked about a lot. The Maitreya prophecy. This was a good one. This is the question that I put on the postcard. Was Krishnamurti the future Buddha? Obviously, from what I've suggested so far, the answer is yes, in the way that we've just explained. This brought in a whole fascinating world of the Tibetan lore, the Tibetan mythology, the Tibetan worldview. And we know that they have oracles, they have mediums, they had all kinds of things, whole mythological constructs that are thousands of years old that influenced Blavatsky. Blavatsky was influenced greatly by the Tibetan structure. The idea that Krishnamurti was to be the vehicle for the future Buddha or the Maitreya, that was the prophecy. We need a vehicle. The vehicle is an oracle construct. And we talked about oracles in Tibet. Because again, as I'm reading this, as you very well may know, there is still to this day a state Tibetan oracle. And it was the oracle that was given credit to get the Dalai Lama out of Tibet when the Chinese were coming. So I'm reading this history of the role that the oracle played. You have the scholarly teachers, but then you have the oracle and the role of the oracle. Now, when you take a look at the early years of Krishnamurti and the myths and the ideas that the early theosophists had about this, they were tremendously influenced by this frame. 1924, 1925, 1928 kind of thing in that period. Kay increasingly said, I'm sorry, that's not the framework. His term was there was a blending of consciousness. I'm not a vehicle, a medium that this is transmitting, being possessed by and expressing, which was the oracle tradition. So we spent a lot of time kind of exploring the Tibetan history and how it influenced theosophy and how it came back, how Kay reframed that whole thing, and how that reframing of it was the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of Kay's relationship with the theosophical model that they had cast him in. There were certain ideas that were misperceptions from his enlightened perspective. And that caused a lot of trouble because there were a great many of the early theosophists that were quite close to Kay at that time that were completely invested in the original, shall I say, mythological construct that Blavatsky had put forward. Kay said, no, that's not quite the way it is. But that meant that the identity that many of these leaders had invested in this structure was challenged by his pronouncements and by his reframing of what was actually going on. And this was a big deal. So we spent some time going into that. What time? What time do we have? What time do we end?
11:30, and we end at 12:05.
So we have some more time.
Will you take a question or two?
Yes, yeah, we can. Would you like?
Yeah, I have a question about the title of the book.
Please.
Hang on 1 second. Because we have an audience online, we do need to use the microphone. It seems a little odd for us, but if you don't mind speaking.
Michael, it seems to me a person could look at the book and say, well, why wasn't it just called Awakening, Buddha's Awakening, Krishnamurti's Insight? But you've chosen the title Always Awakening. You've mentioned here earlier today that transformation or seeing or whatever it is an instantaneous thing. But there seems to be something implied in the title. Would you
Well, thank you.
Would you go into that?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, the cognitive part of us loves to hold on to things. It, you know, as soon as it becomes known, we hold on to it, which means that we fell out of awakening. Does that make sense? Awakening comes to closure as soon as cognition comes in and I'm awakened, and so on and so forth. The notion that that you're always awakening. You're never done. It's not like, okay, I'm going to wake up. It's this constant refreshing of this quality of awakening. Constantly, never ending, always awakening. And it wasn't my term. This emerged, he said, Rinpoche said, and we call this always awakening. So he has there's a Buddhist, this is right out of his tradition, this use of the word always awakening. But I loved it. I thought that it was so wonderful because you use the story of Rip Van Winkle, you know? He went and he played and then he fell asleep forever and ever and then he woke up again and oh my gosh, the world is... Well, every time we have a thought, we're actually falling back asleep. In a way, you could look at it that way. We have an estimated 20 to 50,000 thoughts a day. The vast majority of those thoughts are thoughts that we had yesterday. They are reflexive. They are reflexes. So this whole stream of what we call thought, but even bigger than that, it is our identity and it is our personal, social, self-world view reality. That is contained in the 20 to 50,000 thoughts that we have every day. The continuation of that creates reality as we know it. In the Buddhist tradition in Tibet, they have this classic image of samsara, I think is how it's pronounced. And you see this big belly and this kind of monstrous guy, and he's peering over there with gnarly teeth, and in the middle of the circle is the pig and the snake and so on and so forth, which is desire and grasping and so on. And then you have the realms. You have the realm of the hungry ghosts, and you have the various realms that we all live in. And this collective thing is reality. And the always awakening is always awakening out of that mental state. So I thank you for that, because to me, you're never there, you're never finished, it's always awakening. And to me, it was just so refreshing, such a refreshing thing. Thank you. Yep. Anybody else for now? And then we can... Sorry?
The word always has a connotation of time. So I would be interested in exploring it. In what sense is it always? with K's approach, time is a very important factor. So
Yeah, I don't think that the always in that sense is trying to, again, time is all part of this samsara reality structure. It's all cognitive. Time is a cognitive form. So the always here is never finished or never done, or there's no arriving. And we could go into becoming, because the whole idea of psychological becoming was a theme that we talked about. And in Tibetan terms, or in Buddhist terms, their core concept is grasping. Grasping. And I love it. It's so great. These guys have been looking at this for thousands of years with this analytical, careful, precise thing. And their term is grasping. So the essence of K's use of the word, there's no becoming. The ending of time is no becoming, is no psychological becoming. When you go into that, we're rather, all the paths, all the methods, all the practices, all the study, all of that implies a certain quality of becoming, that you're going to get something out of it, and so on and so forth, that you're going to grow spiritually, spiritual progress. All of those things imply time, and they imply becoming. Or excuse me, they imply grasping. What we call realization or enlightenment is the ending of grasping. That grasping stops. The greed stops. You could say desire, you could say all these things, but it's the grasping, it's the energy of grasping after that creates the wheel, that creates the whole cycle, is the desire to grasp. And in the quote that I read of Kay's, we can go into that because it's certainly when you put that question, because you're serious, because you're intent, then you're aware of the whole process of the observer, which means that you're totally attentive, completely attentive, always awakening. And in that attention, there's no border created by the center. Grasping implies a center, implies that, and that creates the border, and that actually creates the whole thing. We've put away the observer, and therefore there is attention which may last a second. That's good enough. Don't be greedy to have more. In that greed, you've already created the center. This is in essence what the Buddhists mean by grasping. Is that and it's just wonderfully lucid and wonderfully precise, and you look at the symbol and so on and so forth, and you see how all of this kind of makes so much sense in a non-academic way. We talked about all Buddhas see the same truth. We mentioned that earlier. Another theme was ignorance cannot be removed by ignorance. That goes right back to this notion that we talked about earlier, this conversion. This relates to this idea that we're converting. Ignorance can't be negated by ignorance. So there's a stepping out. You have to stop ignorance in order for something else to take place, and that's the thing. Einstein says you can't, solve a problem at the level of the problem. Very similar kind of observation here. One of the things that we spent some time doing in the Secret Aura teachings, there was this little chart, and it listed all the virtues: giving to the poor, taking care of the elderly, There was a whole list, maybe 20 different virtues. And then there were two columns. there is what we might call regular virtue, being a good guy, doing, helping people, etc., etc. And then on the other side, it was the golden virtue. And the difference between regular old virtue and the golden virtue was whether or not an ego was involved. I remember Ted Turner donating some $20 million or something to some charity. And he got all these accolades for being such a wonderful guy. Well, he actually made 30 billion, or he actually made money giving this away, right? The point being, when you look at all the churches, when you go through Europe and you see the cathedrals, you see that they were built by families. Wealthy families built the cathedrals as social statements that gave power and esteem to the family. And with or without an ego, change is a game changer. And this also floats back to what we were talking about earlier, with or without an ego in terms of spiritual practice and, or even enlightenment, so on and so forth. So this idea of negating the ego and what is an action that isn't influenced by the ego, and the same action that's influenced by the ego, and you see that they're completely different. So with or without an ego became fundamental. I was talking with a colleague about Kundalini, and we had an engagement with Professor Krishna the other night at Crotona, or not at Crotona, at the Ojai retreat, and he was questioning about cities and so-called spiritual powers. And again, imagine an ego that now was given kind of magic powers. Where's that going to lead? Now, imagine somebody that didn't have an ego, and subtle perceptions and capacities came into view, but there was no ego that was going to use those for power and gain and so on and so forth. You have a completely different action that occurs with or without the ego. So we spent a fair amount of time exploring how clever the ego is, how it falsely takes credit for so many things. Oh, look what I did, and so on. So this idea of the ego and negation of the ego is threaded throughout the whole thing. One of the near the end of our conversations, we were talking about Kay's true gift or legacy. What was Kay doing in all of these talks and all of these things? And I shared with Rinpoche that for many years, Kay gave me a headache. I would listen and I would struggle and I would be trying to get it, and I would get some pieces, I would understand what this, but I never felt like I understood the whole thing. So I said, he gave me a headache. Rinpoche's observation was that the true essence of Krishnamurti's work was to challenge our habits of thought and our habits of perception, to challenge them. If you look at Kay's teachings from the standpoint of not this idea about that idea, it wasn't about an idea, but if you look at it, that he was shaking us, and you see this over and over and over again in conversations with trustees, and he was hammering, and he would cut no slack, right? He would push you into a corner and continue to shake, regardless of what the subject was. Rinpoche was saying that was his true gift or function, was to shake the habits of mind that humanity is stuck in, and not give it any way of, easing itself back out, or, again, not giving it any room. And I think that there's great truth to this framing of where Krishnamurti's real gift is to shake us. So that was the headache, right? My headache was being challenged and shook. And then we go into how confusion and being shook opens us to seeing something new. And that was really what he was doing. He was shaking us out of our habits so that we could awaken to another way of looking. And I really love that. Rinpoche also said that, this has back to do with this idea of attunement and resonance. He said Krishnamurti's influence was still alive, everything Kay did is still being done. It's still happening. It's still vibrant, if you want to call it that. And that the real challenge is for us to become attuned to that. Now, if you want to go back to the Maitreya prophecy, if you want to go back historically, this is not just with Kay, because we're really not talking about Kay. Kay even said of himself, I'm nothing. I'm a telephone. I'm a poster. I'm a road sign that says, look to the left. That's all he was. But it was this quality of state. The state that the Buddhists call Buddha mind or Buddha consciousness is really part of us that's being blocked by our nonsense, by our misperception of who we think we are. And as long as we hold on to that misperception of who we think we are, we don't realize that we are this other. And that's the big jump. He concludes by saying to understand the teachings, you need to understand yourself. Right? And I'm reminded I think it was, when did the international trustee gathering with the perfume of the teachings? It was late 77. So in 1977, Krishnaji had a feeling that, he wasn't going to last forever. And he brought trustees from around the world here. They spent a week. It was a week or more? A month. Oh my God. Can you imagine being stuck in a room with Krishnamurti for a month and having him do this every single day? I mean, really, that's what he was doing. And when you read the transcripts of these things, it was a pencil grinder. He began by saying, what I'm talking about is not in the books. You can read the books all day long, and it's not there. It's not in the videotapes. It's a living thing, he said. So this is this quality of attunement that I'm pointing to and that we go into here in the book. And I have to say that I think that reading the book and it's the unique format of the book is, as we described earlier, this 2-page format. So we have the narrative, our conversation on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side you have quotes from Kay, or quotes from the Dalai Lama, or quotes from scholars, or other quotes. David Bohm is in there quite a bit, and so on and so forth. So you have this blending of these 2 pages going back and forth, and you read this, and then you have to go back and you read this. So it's a very different read. It's not a linear, straightforward kind of read. It is a journey or an experience that is created here that I think is really unique and powerful. And I think that the lucid quality of Rinpoche's tradition and his preciseness and the metaphors that he's using to explain certain things has a quality of pulling the curtain back. That's not just what I said. That was actually what David Skitt said. David is an editor in the UK of some of Kay's teachings, or some of his books. Where is it? Okay. Always awakening renders me somewhat speechless. It confirms what I felt after 12 years in Tibetan Buddhism, that there was no difference at the deep level between Tibetan Buddhism and Krishnamurti. I haven't finished absorbing the book, perhaps I never will. The effect of drawing apart a heavy curtain. Oh, it has the effect of drawing apart a heavy curtain. So, all I can say is, James is a fan. He read the book, and he, as I quoted on the card, said it was one of the most important contributions to Kay's legacy that he's seen. I think it's true. I don't think that there's anything like it. And any questions? We have 10 minutes.
Hang on 1 second. Thank you so much.
I would like to know why I didn't have the pleasure to see Rinpoche a year ago here in this conference, because he was scheduled. Do I am correctly?
Yeah, it was I believe last year. He was going to come. He and a colleague were going to come, and the colleague got an infection and died very suddenly. He was a physician, and that's why he didn't come. It was because of the loss of our friend. Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm not familiar with Krishnamurti's teachings at all. Some basic fundamentals, but you were talking about one of the main teaching that he keeps on manifesting or transmitting in 1,000 different ways. One thing that you were talking about was a lot of things we do is like translating the unknown to the known as a way of making sense of the world, or how our mind works. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Basically, when we have, again, nobody can do the work for you. Nobody can enlighten you. No book can do it. No, nothing can do it. Right? It's really your job to see that much of what you're doing is false, and to negate the false views that we have about ourselves and others, etc. When we have teachers like the Buddha or like Krishnamurti who come along and they say things and that we don't understand, they talk about realms or they talk about experiences. Again, in Krishnamurti had this thing called the process that went on. He had all kinds of experiences that were unusual or mysterious. And what the Rinpoche was saying was, don't pay much attention to those, because they will always be mysterious. Whatever you think they're doing is what you think they're doing, and not whatever it is that they're talking about. And this had to do with this idea of us constantly translating the high into the low. They're saying something it's a metaphor. Anytime they're saying anything, it's always a metaphor. It's simply a symbol, like a road sign that's pointing to something. So all the teachings are metaphors. Buddhism is a metaphor. Everything Kay ever talked about, it's all metaphor. And we need to guard against what's called reification, which is taking an abstraction and converting it into a concrete form. Our ego is the best example of reification. We take this abstraction about the idea that who we think we are, and we reify it. We pretend as though it is a real concrete thing. You could go into Buddhist teachings, and that's the essence of independent originations. We have all kinds of reality constructs that when you really look at it, don't hold the test. So this idea of conversion, which is what you questioned, is when teachers speak of things that appear mysterious, and we could talk about examples in various realms, whatever we think is always going to be a relative thing. You know, they're speaking from an absolute perspective. We're hearing it with relative ears, and we're converting that absolute into a relative in order for us to relate to it and engage it. And so he was saying, be careful of that, because it's something that brain does all the time, and it's implicit in this idea we started with about not comparing. Again, we cause ourselves all kinds of trouble because of this idea that we are converting something over here and translating it into what we know so that we can then think and react to it and so on and so forth. And it's a fallacy or a problem that we keep falling asleep instead of falling awake. We keep falling asleep over and over again, and this is a fundamental thing that we tend to do. I would just say that what all of these teachers are pointing to is not an idea. What all of them are pointing to isn't part of cognition, the cognitive realm. They're pointing to a state. Buddha consciousness, or silence as Kay would talk about it, is a state. It's not an idea. We can have ideas about it, and we do, but when he said the word is not the thing, I mean, this is his very simple way of helping us with that. The description is not the described. What he wants you to do is experience the thing, not tread water with the metaphor. Yes, sir?
You talked about attention. Is there any words you can use to explain a little more about what you mean by that? I know it's a tough thing to talk about, but I see what you're saying on the pillar of the top one. It's important.
Well, it's the foundation. Yeah, it is. Attention is the foundation, and Kay is quite clear about that. The very first program I did way back in the early 70s with this was a little, he gave a talk, Kay gave a talk to teachers and parents in the Grove. And I took the soundtrack of that talk, which was an hour, a little bit more than an hour, and I cut it down to 10 minutes as an exercise in editing, because there was a lot of ballyhoo about not being able to edit Kay. If you take a slice out of her, this is kind of a heresy to edit him. And I was a young filmmaker, so how can you do anything without editing? You have to edit. That's the nature of the beast. So I wanted to see if I could actually edit something and have it hold the essence. And I did. I made a 10-minute thing, and it was really quite powerful, because editing often distills. So quality of attention was the name of that program. The quality of attention. If you look at your normal day-to-day experience, if you have this 20 to 50,000 thoughts percolating like a pinball machine, is my metaphor. Ding, 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 ding. These balls going around, and this is bumping into that one, and that's bumping into this one. And that's going on all the time. That's actually, every time that little bell or that reflexive thing happens, it's actually grabbing some of your attention. You have a finite amount of attention. And you are, in a way, I think a very strong way, you are what you give your attention to. That moment. You are enchanted by what you give your attention to. When Kay talks about being quiet and having complete attention, And there's no border created by the center, which is stealing your attention. It's condensing your attention into that center. What the Tibetan's description, and this might be I'll read it to you, is actually having attention that is vast. It's it's not a little pea brain, a little pea bit of attention because it's being condensed, but it's expansive and vast and in all directions. Let me read this because I think it's a wonderful description and it has a lot to do with what we're talking about in terms of attention. Forgive me for, let me find this thing. I don't know where it is. I'll try to paraphrase. This is a really poor paraphrase. But this was not Rinpoche, but another Rinpoche. And he was describing this Buddha consciousness. And he said, imagine thoughts being like clouds floating in the sky. And your thoughts are like clouds floating in the sky. Now, we have 20 to 50,000 of those clouds floating in the sky. And that's what we see. Now imagine that all those clouds disappeared. And there were no clouds, and it wasn't even looking in a direction, but your perception is 360 degrees in all directions, right? And this was the image that they use about a vast sky without anything going. And Kay in the 45 was in India, and he was talking with Pupul and some of his colleagues way back then, and he used a very similar thing. And then comes the thought. In this vast thing, a thought comes, and it was like a dot, right? And this idea of it coalescing, of consciousness coalescing into that little cloud. And then comes another cloud, and then comes another cloud, and then comes another cloud. And that's what we call reality. That's what we call consciousness, are the clouds. When Kay said the content of consciousness is consciousness, that's what he's referring to. He's referring to the clouds. That's what we think consciousness is the clouds. And what he's suggesting, and what the other Buddhists are suggesting, is that when all those clouds disappear, there is another reality. And Kay says, and that the brain can never capture and hold on to, and so on. So he really goes into it in some wonderful ways, but there are very clear parallels with this notion. So being able to pay attention means well, freeing yourself from the cloud machine, it's freeing yourself from that reflex. Because that's why I use a pinball machine, because it's ding, 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 and one hits the other, and then triggers the other, and it's the associative process that's going on. And that's our reality. And Bohm would say there's very little intelligence in a reflex. There's very little intelligence in that cloud-based reality. Real intelligence comes when there's gaps in the clouds, and we actually see something more whole. And that's the insight, and so on and so forth. Mark?
Just further on the question of attention.
Yeah, we're stuck at the table.
Krishnji said to us that concentration is the enemy of attention. And he said, don't allow children to concentrate. Deal with that.
Yeah. you know, in Mark's, there is a quote in here. There's a quote in here from Mark's book, and it's also, I think, you know, I put it in there because it's so important, and it draws attention. It distinguishes between what I'm going to call sensory perception and cognition or thought, and this is reminiscent of it, you know. Kay wanted the children to be highly sensitive to what's going on in a sensory way. So highly sensitive in a sensory way. And I think that there's and that's all, and yet here we are in the schools and in this, you know, test and drill and all that stuff. We're making these kids, you know, move all of their energy and attention into this cognitive P, this very tight little P, small thing, at the exclusion of everything else. And that's the downfall that he was pointing to. So being able to cultivate this vast, you know, let the clouds disappear. And as you take a walk, you know, one of my saving graces has been little Carly that you saw when she was here. So Carly's 2.5. And I could not be with Carly if I was in thought, if I was thinking about stuff, if I was worried about things. So to be with this pre-verbal child who was exploding with everything, I had to be quiet. I had to really be quiet, and then I could be with her and relate to her, and so she really helped me being able to have a silent mind. But this quality, and it all gets back to this quality of attention. So I found myself. I'll tell you a very quick story, and then our time is up. It was a hot day, and we were walking up a hill. And we had a bicycle, so I'm standing in the heat, and Carly's back here, and she discovered this pile of dust. I mean, literally, real fine powdery dust. And she stopped, and she was like scooping it like an hourglass, and I, of course, as I'm up there, and I'm going, God damn it, it's time, it's time to go. And I realized that I didn't see the pile of dust. I walked right over it, right? She was there, fully present, exploring, and her purpose was to experience as much as possible while she went up the path. My goal was to get up the path at the exclusion, at the negation of what she was doing, of experience everything while I'm walking up the path. And I really had to laugh at myself and sit down and just sit in the shade and let all that go and become aware and give attention to everything that was going on around, the buzz of the birds and the trees and the kid and all of that stuff. So she has been a constant reminder for me to always awaken. Thank you.